Have any of you ever used the phrase, he or she just doesn't get it? They just don't get it. Or we're not on the same wavelength. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt comfortable with somebody or a little bit repelled? Or have you found yourself thinking the words, oh, that resonates with me? Last week, I talked about how it is time for us to begin to understand that we have to come up with a new way of being, that we live in a new world, and it is time to embrace that world. The world as we know it no longer works. And that's all there is to it. It doesn't work. And having the same conversation and arguments that we have been having for decades no longer works. And so I feel like my purpose and my passion is helping us to work through, awaken to, and embrace this new paradigm. Because I know that it's here. I know that it is here. I know it's in my heart, and we have to embrace this new paradigm because the world as we are currently living it and experiencing it and being in it cannot sustain us. And as I say this, I always understand that what I am advocating, that this is what I'm advocating for, this new way of being. I understand I'm talking to an American congregation in the year 2022. So this new way for us is not necessarily a new way of being in the world for everybody, but in this Western culture, it is a new paradigm. And the bulk of what I want to share today, I've talked about before. And so if some of this sounds familiar, it is. But I share these concepts today and I continue to share them because I do believe that this new paradigm is at least part of the answer to where we go from here. And so I want to share with you today some of the insights and thoughts I had, believe it or not, I think it was over 3 years ago now when I was on my sabbatical. And when I actually had that opening in that space to really reflect on and open up to some of the wisdom and guidance that came to me. So I shared the bulk of this sermon about 3 years ago, and you hear me talking about frequency and energy and all of this stuff a lot. But for those of you who are newer and don't always know what I'm talking about when I talk about the vertical or energy or frequency, I'm going to share today, this is kind of the foundation building block of how I understand ultimate reality. So as I was preparing for my sabbatical a few years ago, I started coming across readings, concepts, and books that were making so much sense to me, and my world paradigm began to change as the scientific and the spiritual began to merge for me. And so I started thinking about this years ago, and in light of everything that is still happening in the world, it feels as relevant, if not more so, today. So according to psychologist Dr. David Hawkins, a PhD in the field of consciousness, our bodies are unconscious antennas and are always picking up on subtle energetic cues that our conscious minds have no awareness of. And he believes that we can access this unconscious awareness through what he calls behavioral kinesiology calibrations. And over the course of about 20 years and working with thousands of people, Hopkins has come up with what he calls the map of human consciousness. And this is a chart that goes, I'll show it here. I don't know if people on Zoom can see it, but I have it here. It's a chart that goes from 1 to 1,000 that looks at different frequency levels and equates them with different levels of human emotions and human understanding. And so this map begins at a level 20, which represents the frequency of shame, and it goes up to the highest level of 1,000, representing the frequency of unconditional love as expressed through people like Jesus, Krishna, and Buddha. According to Hopkins, we are all vibrating at some level of frequency. And when we can understand that, then we can begin to better understand ourselves and one another, allowing us to make sense of this crazy world that we live in. So he uses the human body and kinesiology muscle testing to calibrate these levels. And he says, quote, initially, the most striking findings of kinesiology was a clear demonstration that muscles instantly become weak when the body is exposed to harmful stimuli. And it goes strong with beneficial stimuli. And he goes into great detail in his book, Power versus Force, about how he has come up with these calibrations and the scientific methodology behind his research. And while I find that fascinating in and of itself, that's not really what I want to focus on today, because that could take up an entire sermon in itself. So what I want to focus on this morning is the emotional, physical, and spiritual ramifications of his research. He says, on our scale of consciousness, there are two critical points that allow for major advancement. The first is at 200, the initial level of empowerment. And here, the willingness to stop blaming and accept responsibility for one's own actions, feelings, and beliefs arise. As long as the cause and responsibility are projected outside of oneself, one will remain in the powerless mode of victimhood. So once we get to a vibration of 200, we have raised our vibration out of victimhood. And he says the second level is at 500, which is reached by accepting love and non-judgmental forgiveness as a lifestyle, exercising unconditional kindness to all persons, things, and events without exception. So he says anything over 200 is considered life affirming, and under 200 is life denying. And this is where we see the difference between power, which is innate and internal, and force, which is always external. And so we can look at the world around us at external events, for example, like Hurricane Florence, and we see, or Katrina, or any of these natural disasters, and we see pictures of neighbors coming together to save each other, to rescue animals. We hear the strong conviction, we will rebuild. Things like this happen, and we see people living into that unconditional love, putting people first, and we are inspired. But at the same time, we can also see pictures of other people looting, companies deciding that they might be able to make a profit by charging $10 for a bottle of water. And we look at them and we say to ourselves, what are they thinking? And we're literally brought down or repelled by that behavior. And so according to the Hawkins map of consciousness, people are simply acting out of their frequency level. We see, for instance, Hawkins says, we see, for instance, that a person in grief, which calibrates at the low level of 75, will actually be in a much better condition if he rises to anger, which calibrates at 150. Anger itself is a destructive emotion and it's still in a low state of consciousness, but as social history shows, apathy can imprison entire subcultures as well as individuals. So if the hopeless can come from apathy into anger and then get to the point that they want to desire something better, desires at 125, and then use that anger, that calibration of anger, to develop into pride, which is at 175, they may be able to take the step to courage, which calibrates at 200, and to proceed to improve their individual or collective conditions. So I hope this makes sense, but that's kind of what I was talking about with the children, that if we are just feeling completely hopeless and we're sad, we're just, our energy is so low, it's almost hard to get out of bed and do anything. But as it rises, we do go through that phase of anger. Well, this is not right. But that is an energy that can help propel us to hopefully get into those higher, more life-affirming states of consciousness. And I have been fascinated with this concept because I have very much been affected, as you all know, watching me every Sunday for years. I've been affected by the current events in this country for the last 6 years now. And every day we turn on the news and there's a boggled reporter saying, well, this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. And over the years, I've had so many conversations with many of you and friends and family, wondering what is going on and how can something that is so clear to me and so obvious be so not obvious to other people. And I've said at times, it's almost like we're living in two different universes with totally different understandings of ultimate reality. And as we know over the years, and even this summer, that divide seems to just be getting bigger and bigger. With the pandemic, the protests, the Supreme Court decisions, it just seems to be getting wider and wider. But I do think that if we can begin to look at this, as Carolyn Mace said last week when I was quoting her, not from a left or a right, but from a vertical understanding of what is going on, maybe it can help us to stay grounded and centered and calm and relax, because then we are giving ourselves our own power back. And it is about where we're vibrating within ourselves. And so Albert Einstein once said, the solution to a problem is never found with the same thinking that created the problem. And that is so true. So in other words, if we want to fix this mess we are in, we need to come at it from a different perspective than the one that created it. And Michelle Obama, in one of her speeches a few years ago, said, when they go low, we go high. And looking at this from the level of consciousness, That is exactly what Carolyn Mace was saying last week. When this mother said to this young man, "I am going to kill you," we all assumed that that meant she would come from the same level of consciousness that he was at and exact her revenge. And many of us would think that perhaps she was justified, an eye for an eye, so to speak. And yet she understood that true healing and change could not and would not be had with the same type of low consciousness thinking that took her son from her. So she elevated herself first, came from a higher level of consciousness, and as a result, she raised this young man up out of the negative, destructive place that he was in. And I've shared this story a few times with many of you also, but I just love this image that I have a friend who has done some studying with Thich Nhat Hanh. And one day she told me about how he showed his students a video with no sound. And it was a fight during a riot between two groups of people. And he only showed the video demonstrating the behavior, the body language, the violence, and the anger. And then he asked them which group was coming from a place of moral superiority. The students couldn't answer that because to simply look at the body language and the behavior, there was no difference between the two groups. And that is the problem, and that is also the key. Because even though one group may have been morally justified in the violence or the anger, the problem is that it doesn't matter because they were acting out of the same level of consciousness, which was simply perpetuating the problem. And so Hopkins also argues, as I just said, anger can be a fulcrum by which the oppressed are eventually catapulted into freedom. So fury over social injustice, victimization, and inequality has created great movements that led to major changes in the structures of society. So there is a place for anger, there is a role for anger, but we cannot get stuck in the anger because then nothing ever changes. We have to perhaps move through the anger, but we have to understand that as we're moving through the anger, we are moving towards something else, something higher, a better, more open state of frequency. And so when you have two groups feeding into anger, they just perpetuate it. So Hawkins says a self-justified positionality is the real enemy of peace. When solutions are sought on the level of coercion, I can't say that, no peaceful resolution is possible. And so that's why when we see some of these riots or people protesting or injustices happening, at least I'll only speak for myself, but when you see all the riots and the anger, and then you see, even if it's only one or two people standing in the midst of that, quietly, calmly, maybe locking arms or holding hands or praying, there's a sense of safety, and you think, okay, these are the people that are going to calm it down because they have intentionally brought themselves to a different level. And that does make a difference. So he Hawkins believed that the motivation of Mahatma Gandhi calibrated at 700. And he says that was the top of the range of normal human consciousness. And he argues that Gandhi won his struggle because his position was one of far greater power, internal high vibration, versus the British Empire, which represented force. And whenever force meets power, force is eventually defeated. And I just love that. I love that new understanding of power, that power comes from inside of us, down through those higher frequencies and out. And when we are emoting out, people can't get into our energetic field. They can't reach us. And that is true power versus the force of putting things on other people. And right now, I think we live in a culture that still understands and uses force. But what I'm arguing for, I guess, today is that maybe it's time that we begin to truly understand power, that we begin to understand our own power. We begin to embrace our own power, and then we move out from that power. And we see what happens. Because just going back and forth with other people, in my perspective, is not what is needed right now. And so I want to close today with the example in his book that I just love. And I've also shared this, but I just think it's such a great understanding conceptually of what he's talking about in his book. He gives the example of what happens when you view somebody from all of these different levels. So he takes the example of a homeless person and how we might experience that person at these different levels of consciousness. So he says, in an upscale neighborhood stands an old man in tattered clothes, alone and leaning against the corner of an elegant brownstone. Look at him from the perspective of various levels of consciousness and note the inconsistency in how he appears to different people and viewpoints. From the bottom of the scale, at a level of 20, shame, the bum may seem to be dirty, disgusting, disgraceful. From the level of 30, guilt, he'd be blamed for his condition. He deserves what he gets. He's probably lazy, a welfare cheat. At 50, hopelessness, his plight would appear desperate, a damning piece of evidence to prove that society just can't do anything about this. At 75, grief, the man looks tragic, friendless, and forlorn. At a consciousness level of 100, fear, we might see the man as a threatening social misfit. Perhaps we should call the police before he commits a crime. At 125, desire, he might represent a frustrating problem. Why doesn't somebody do something? At 150, anger, the old man might look like he could be violent, or on the other hand, one could be furious that such horrible conditions exist in our country today. At 175, pride, he could be seen as an embarrassment or lacking in self-respect to better himself. At 200, courage, we might be motivated to wonder if there is a local homeless shelter. All he needs is a job and a place to live. At 250, neutrality, the man looks okay, maybe even interesting. Live and let live, we might say. After all, he's not hurting anybody. At 310, willingness, we might decide to go down and see what we can do to cheer the fellow up on the corner. Maybe we'd be motivated to volunteer sometime at the local shelter. At 3:50 acceptance, the man on the corner appears intriguing. He probably has an interesting story to tell. Where he's from and how he ended up where he is, maybe reasons we'll never understand. At 400 reason, he's a symptom of the current economic and social malaise, or perhaps a good subject for an in-depth psychological study. At the higher levels, the old man begins to look not only interesting, but friendly, and then lovable. Perhaps we'd then be able to see that he was in fact the one who had transcended social limits and gone free. Maybe he's a joyful old guy with the wisdom of age, and in his face, the serenity that comes from indifference to material things. At 600 peace, he's revealed as our own self in a temporary expression. At each new level of consciousness, nothing has changed and everything has changed. But the only thing that has changed is our perspective, because that old man is still standing in the same place, still wearing the same clothes, still being who he is. And I don't know about all of you, but being able to look at the world through that lens has offered me a sense of hope. It's offered me a new perspective, which I can approach things that I don't understand with a new layer of compassion. It has helped me to begin, instead of feeling just hopeless or apathetic or angry, understanding that I might actually have some power to make a change in a new way has been sustaining and soul uplifting for me. And so I invite us to think about this today, that the world is not black and white. People are experiencing reality from their unique perspective, and everybody is doing the best that they can from the paradigm that they are coming from, even if we don't understand it. And so what is the answer? I still don't know, but that's what I'm struggling with. I'll continue to struggle with it this year, but I'm hopeful that there is that third way, there is a new way, and as we understand it and embrace it, we just might be that power of change that we are hoping to see in this world. And so with that, let us sing our final song, May the Long Time Sun Shine.